December 1st, 1937. Kure Naval Arsenal, Hiroshima Bay. Cold morning mist drifts across the shipyard. The smell of salt and iron fills the air. Beneath towering cranes, hundreds of Japanese workers move in perfect rhythm. Sparks bloom as molten steel meets the hull of a new giant. A white chalk number glows on the beam. Shokaku, hull number 37. Hammers echo against the water. The sound carries over the bay, past rows of incomplete warships, a symphony of rising ambition. Japan's empire is preparing for something vast, something unstoppable. Half a world away, in America, shipyards lie quiet. The Great Depression still lingers, steel mills idle, men without work. No one yet imagines the thunder that will come. But here, in Kure, the future is being forged. A floating city of armor and aircraft, born from secrecy, discipline, and desperation. Within 3 years, Japan will launch 6 such leviathans, each a blade in the Imperial Navy's hand. And across the Pacific, a sleeping giant will answer, not with 6, but with 17. What began as a war of strategy will become a war of steel, fire, and production itself. In the late 1930s, the Pacific was still quiet, vast, blue, and deceptive. But beneath the calm surface, 2 powers were preparing for a confrontation that would reshape naval warfare forever. Japan's rise as a naval power had begun decades earlier, in the wake of its victories over China and Russia. The lessons of the early 20th century were clear. The nation's survival depended on control of the sea. Every barrel of oil, every grain of rubber, every ton of ore had to cross oceans, and those oceans needed to be protected or conquered. By 1936, Japan had broken free from the Washington Naval Treaty's limits. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kaigan, began planning what they called the decisive battle doctrine, the Kantai Kessen. It envisioned a single massive clash with the U.S. Pacific Fleet, somewhere in the Western Pacific, where Japan's superior skill and technology would deliver a knockout blow. To achieve that, Japan needed floating airfields, fast, deadly, and independent. Thus began the race to build a new kind of weapon, the fleet carrier. The first of these, Akagi and Kaga, were born not from peacetime ambition, but from treaty compromise. Originally battle cruisers and battleships, they were converted into carriers during the 1920s, experimental hybrids for a navy still finding its doctrine. By the late 1930s, they had evolved into something formidable. 250 meters of steel deck carrying aircraft that could strike hundreds of miles away. But Japan's engineers wanted more. Faster ships, stronger decks, better coordination between air and sea. In 1937, plans were drawn for Soryu and Hiryu, light, swift carriers emphasizing speed and striking power over armor. They reflected Japan's tactical philosophy: offense above all else, precision before protection. Then came the pinnacle. Shokaku and Zuikaku, laid down in 1937 and completed by 1941. These ships embodied everything Japan had learned. They were modern, elegant, balanced, capable of carrying 84 aircraft each, their hulls reinforced yet light enough to maintain 34 knots. They represented a nation at the height of its industrial and naval genius, capable of designing masterpieces with limited resources. Every bolt, every propeller blade was crafted by hand. Factories in Yokosuka, Kure, and Nagasaki worked around the clock, guided by meticulous engineers and naval architects. The process was slow but exact, a reflection of Japanese craftsmanship. Behind it all stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who had studied in America, who understood both its strengths and its blindness. He warned Tokyo's leaders, "In the first 6 months of war with the United States and Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. He knew what Japan could build. He also knew what America could build. And that was the difference. When Shokaku and Zuikaku joined the fleet, Japan had achieved a miracle of focus. 6 first-line carriers, each a weapon of precision. Together, they formed the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force on Earth. By December 1941, these 6 would move as one, across thousands of miles of ocean, unseen and unstoppable, toward a small harbor in Hawaii. Their aircraft would rise into the dawn and announce to the world that the age of the battleship was over. And yet, as Japan's flag flew over the Pacific, another force, vast, industrial, and patient, was beginning to awaken on the far side of the ocean. The story of Japan's 6 carriers was one of skill and courage. The story of America's response would be one of scale and inevitability. When Japan's 6 carriers steamed toward Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had only 7 operational fleet carriers of its own, and most were scattered across the Pacific and Atlantic. America's shipyards were busy, but not yet awakened. Its people were weary of war. That would change in a single morning. December 7th, 1941. The thunder of torpedoes and the rising smoke from Battleship Row tore through America's isolation. Within hours, a stunned nation transformed. Factories that had lain silent since the Great Depression roared back to life. Steel mills reignited. Assembly lines that once built cars began building bombers, tanks, and ships. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech became reality. In Washington, naval planners gathered around maps of the Pacific. They understood immediately. Battleships were no longer the center of power. Aircraft carriers, fast, flexible, and deadly, were the future. Within weeks, plans for the Essex-class carriers were approved. It would be the largest carrier construction program in history. Unlike Japan, which relied on limited shipyards and handcrafted engineering, America harnessed an industrial web stretching from coast to coast. The Newport News Shipbuilding Yard in Virginia, the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, and the Fore River Yard in Massachusetts became engines of steel. Private industry, Bethlehem Steel, Kaiser Shipyards, and Newport News competed not for beauty, but for speed. Every carrier that slid off an American dock was less a work of art and more a statement of power. The design philosophy was simple. Build big, build fast, build many. The Essex-class carriers were standardized, modular sections prefabricated in multiple states, then assembled like colossal puzzles. Their engines, radar systems, and elevators followed uniform blueprints, allowing thousands of workers to operate in parallel across the country. By early 1943, America's shipyards were delivering new carriers faster than Japan could replace its losses. While Japanese engineers spent months perfecting rivets and deck angles, American welders worked in 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, surrounded by the clatter of cranes, sparks, and hammers. Every 3 months, a new Essex-class hull touched the water. Every launch meant hundreds of aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses gaining new decks to fly from. This industrial rhythm became a kind of wartime heartbeat. Steel was America's new weapon, and time was its ammunition. Behind this transformation was not just machinery, but leadership. Roosevelt's administration, backed by Admiral Ernest J. King and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, built a production system that made delay impossible. They coordinated with Henry J. Kaiser, the construction genius who had already astonished the world by building Liberty ships in days, not months. Women entered the shipyards, riveters, welders, electricians, their hands steady under the roar of machinery. Across the country, propaganda posters urged, "Speed the victory." For every Japanese Shokaku, America built 3 Essex carriers. For every loss Japan could not replace, the U.S. commissioned another, bigger, faster, more resilient. But this was not merely a contest of output. It was a clash of philosophies. Japan's carriers were symbols of mastery, precise, disciplined, crafted to perfection. America's carriers were symbols of scale, forged from abundance, designed for endurance. When the first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex CV-9, was commissioned in December 1942, it represented the industrial soul of a nation at war. Within 2 years, 17 more would follow, each one a floating airbase, capable of launching nearly 100 aircraft into the sky. By 1944, America had built so many that naval officers stopped counting. The Pacific had become an ocean of steel decks and white wakes stretching to the horizon. Japan's advantage, once measured in daring and design, was dissolving in a sea of American metal. And soon, that imbalance would reveal itself in battle. The next act of this story would unfold in the skies above Midway, where 6 proud Japanese carriers would face a smaller American force, unaware that destiny had already shifted behind the walls of distant factories. Human angle. The hands behind the giant's war is often remembered through generals and admirals. But in this story, its true power lay in the hands of workers who would never see the ocean. In Japan, shipyards like Kure, Yokosuka, and Sasebo were temples of discipline. Every worker was part of a national ritual. Craftsmen who saw their labor as service to the emperor. Men hunched over steel beams with precision hammers, tracing chalk lines across plates of armor thicker than their hands. Women in factory halls sewed flight deck nets and painted aircraft insignia by hand. There was pride in perfection, a spiritual belief that mastery itself could defy the odds. Every rivet was checked twice. Every hull was tested for the perfect curve. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply personal. In contrast, across the Pacific, the human rhythm was louder, faster, and far less sentimental. At Kaiser's shipyards, more than 200,000 men and women, many with no prior industrial experience, built ships in record time. They came from every background: farmers, housewives, mechanics, teachers. The slogan was not perfection, but production. If Japan's shipyards were temples, America's were engines. Sparks flew through night shifts. Lunch whistles echoed through steel caverns. Entire families worked together. Fathers shaping hull frames, daughters welding bulkheads, sons joining the Navy to serve aboard the very ships their parents built. For the first time in modern history, a war machine was truly national. Every citizen became a link in the same chain. The human difference defined the pace of war. Japan built beauty. America built momentum. And in war, momentum is a merciless force. Technological angle. 2 visions of power. If the human element defined tempo, technology defined destiny. Japan's carriers were the pinnacle of naval design. Sleek, aerodynamic, almost artistic in their balance of speed and agility. Ships like Shokaku and Zuikaku used advanced weight-saving techniques, combining thin armor with tight internal layouts to maximize aircraft capacity. Their hangars were compact, elevators efficient, and flight crews exceptionally trained. Their aircraft, too, were extensions of this philosophy: light, long-ranged, and deadly. The A6M-0, Japan's iconic fighter, could outturn anything in the air. The B-5N Kate and D-3A Val dive bombers delivered surgical precision. Together, they created the world's first true carrier strike doctrine: hit first, hit hard, and never let the enemy recover. But that philosophy carried hidden flaws. Japanese designs sacrificed survivability for speed. One well-placed bomb or torpedo could ignite fuel lines and destroy a ship. The carrier decks, made of wood, were vulnerable to fire. Repair facilities were limited, and redundancy, the heart of modern engineering, was rare. America took a different path. The Essex class was heavier, slower, and far less elegant, but it was designed with brutal practicality. Thick steel decks replaced wood. Fire suppression systems and armor belts added weight, but saved lives. The ships carried redundant systems, duplicate power lines, backup pumps, extra generators, ensuring that no single hit would cripple them. The Japanese valued harmony of form. The Americans valued persistence of function. This technological divide reflected deeper truths. Japan's engineers built with pride in the artisan's hand. Ships meant to be perfect from the moment of launch. America's engineers built for the long game. Vessels meant to survive damage, adapt, and return to battle. By 1943, those philosophies would collide across thousands of miles of ocean. And in that collision, one truth would emerge. In modern war, it was not the most beautiful machine that won, but the one that could be replaced. The story of the carriers was no longer just about design or speed. It had become a story about endurance, both human and mechanical. And the test of that endurance was approaching, carried by waves and fate toward a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Leadership angle: Yamamoto versus King and Nimitz. Every machine of war is ultimately an extension of the minds that command it. In the Pacific, two philosophies faced each other. Embodied in three men: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's carrier doctrine, was a man of contradictions. Trained in America, fluent in its language, he admired its culture even as he prepared to destroy its fleet. A strategist rather than a nationalist, Yamamoto understood Japan's limitations more clearly than his peers. He knew that Japan could not win a long war. Its resources were finite, its industry fragile. His plan, the Pearl Harbor strike, was born from logic, not madness. Cripple the U.S. fleet early. Negotiate peace before American factories could awaken. It was an audacious gamble rooted in speed and precision, the same qualities that defined Japan's carriers. Across the ocean stood Admiral Ernest J. King, head of the U.S. Navy. A man as blunt as Yamamoto was refined. King believed in relentless offense. He had little patience for compromise and saw the Pacific not as a battlefield, but as a proving ground for America's industrial strength. Beside him operated Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, calm, analytical, methodical. While King demanded aggression, Nimitz brought balance. He understood that technology and production were now his greatest allies. Each carrier launched, each ship repaired, each convoy delivered. All of it was fuel for a long, patient counterattack. These leaders never met, yet their decisions intertwined like unseen hands moving pieces across the ocean. Yamamoto sought the quick, decisive strike, the elegant knockout. King and Nimitz sought the long, grinding campaign, the war of exhaustion. Leadership shaped destiny as much as ship design did. Yamamoto's fleet fought for immediate supremacy, Nimitz's for eventual inevitability. One fought for honor, the other for endurance. And in that contrast lay the heart of the Pacific War. Moral angle: the weight of pride and the cost of progress. Wars are not fought only with steel. They are fought with belief. And nowhere was belief stronger or more blinding than in Japan's pursuit of victory at sea. For Japan, naval warfare was sacred. The fleet was not just an instrument of power, but a symbol of national destiny, a living embodiment of the emperor's will. Officers trained from youth under the code of Bushido taught that duty and sacrifice were virtues greater than survival. A carrier lost in battle was not a failure. It was a noble offering. This moral framework gave Japan astonishing discipline. pilots who fought to the last round, sailors who refused to abandon ship. But it also created rigidity. When the tide began to turn, the same pride that once fueled victory made adaptation difficult. Every defeat was absorbed not as a lesson, but as tragedy. America's moral center was different. It was pragmatic, mechanical, grounded in results. The U.S. Navy's ethos prized teamwork, innovation, and resilience over honor. Crews were taught not to die for their ship, but to fight to keep it afloat. The American system rewarded feedback. Lessons learned at Coral Sea and Midway were immediately turned into new tactics, new training manuals, and new ship designs. In Japan, tradition delayed change. In America, failure accelerated improvement. Yet both sides carried their own burdens. For Japan's sailors, the moral weight of defeat was unbearable. For America's, the moral weight of mass production, of turning war into a system, carried a quieter kind of cost. Each victory at sea was measured not in glory, but in tonnage, fuel, and casualty reports. In the end, both nations fought with conviction. But one fought for survival of spirit, the other for supremacy of scale. When these moral forces collided, they created not only destruction, but transformation. The war in the Pacific would no longer be just about territory or fleets. It would become a battle over the future itself. Would war be defined by human will or by industrial might? The answer would come soon over a lonely stretch of ocean, a place called Midway. The Battle of Midway. When 6 became. None, June 4th, 1942, Midway Atoll, North Pacific Ocean. The dawn is pale and silent. Low clouds roll over an empty horizon. Beneath them, 6 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, have divided their strength. Only 4 are present. The others are hundreds of miles away, under repair or assignment. The heart of the Kido Butai, once invincible, now sails with a shadow of its former unity. Still, the fleet is confident. They have never known defeat. Admiral Chuichi Nagamo commands from the bridge of Akagi. Around him, aircraft crews prepare meticulously. Torpedoes armed, Zero fighters lined wing to wing. Their target, the tiny island of Midway, a coral fortress bristling with American planes. At 4:30 a.m., the first wave lifts into the sky. The engines roar, leaving the carriers shrouded in mist. Below deck, the Japanese crew cleans, reloads, refuels, an orchestra of discipline. They do not know they are already being watched. High above, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying boat has spotted them. The message flashes through the ether. Enemy carriers sighted. Bearing 320. Distance 180. Admiral Chester Nimitz reads the transmission from his underground command post at Pearl Harbor. His intelligence chief, Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken the Japanese naval code weeks earlier, confirming that AF meant Midway. The trap was set. By 6 a.m., American bombers from Midway are in the air. Outdated B-26 and torpedo-laden TBD Devastators. They attack first, without coordination, striking bravely but suffering terribly. One after another, their aircraft are shot down by Zeros. The sea below glitters with burning wreckage. From Nagamo's bridge, it looks like victory. He orders his reserve aircraft, armed with anti-ship torpedoes, to be reloaded with bombs for another strike on the island. Below decks, sailors roll torpedoes aside, haul bombs across hangar floors, and refuel planes for a second attack. At that moment, fate begins its quiet descent. Far to the east, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, have launched their own waves. Hundreds of planes fill the sky, converging on a single point in the Pacific. At 9:20 a.m., the first American torpedo squadrons arrive. At 9:20 a.m., the first American torpedo squadrons arrive. They attack low and straight, slow, exposed, suicidal. Every one of them is cut down. Not a single torpedo hits. But their sacrifice draws Japan's fighters downward, away from the clouds. At 10:20 a.m., the silence above breaks. From the clear blue sky, American dive bombers, SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise and Yorktown, plunge almost vertically. They have arrived by accident, guided by luck, instinct, and radio fragments. Below them, Japan's carriers are exposed. Decks filled with fueled planes, scattered bombs, and open hangars. In the next 5 minutes, the Pacific War changes forever. 3 bombs strike Akagi. One penetrates the hangar deck and ignites aviation fuel. Flames leap skyward. Within minutes, the flagship of the Kido Butai is an inferno. Kaga takes 4 hits, one directly through the flight deck, detonating bombs waiting for takeoff. The blast tears her open. Soryu is next, hit by 3 bombs engulfed in fire. Only Hiryu remains afloat, desperately launching counterstrikes that manage to hit Yorktown. But by evening, she too will burn. By nightfall, 4 of Japan's 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lie beneath the waves. Over 3,000 sailors are dead. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots gone. Admiral Nagumo watches the horizon darken with smoke and oil. His radio officers transmit final messages. Akagi abandoned. May the Emperor live forever. The Kido Butai, once the pride of the Empire, ceases to exist as an effective force. But the true loss is not measured in ships. It is in the future. Each of those carriers took years to build, crafted by hand, with precision and pride. Japan has neither the materials nor the time to replace them. Across the ocean, America's shipyards are already laying keels for new ones. Faster, stronger, countless. Midway is more than a battle. It is the end of one era and the beginning of another. The moment when art met industry and art lost, the Pacific, once ruled by 6 carriers, will soon swarm with 17 more. A tide of steel that no admiral, no doctrine, and no devotion could stop. The rise of the Essex class. When the tide became a flood Midway was not the end of Japan's war at sea, but it was the end of its momentum. From that day forward, the Pacific belonged to production. While the Japanese shipyards in Kure and Yokosuka struggled to repair the surviving Shokaku and Zuikaku, American shipyards launched a new Essex-class carrier every few months. Their names read like a roll call of power. Lexington, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Yorktown, Satutu, Hornet, 2, Franklin, Ticonderoga. Each was bigger than Japan's largest. Each could carry nearly 100 aircraft, supported by radar, armored decks, and new anti-aircraft batteries that spat fire into the skies. What Japan had built in 6 years, America replaced in 18 months. The numbers alone told the story. By the end of 1943, the Imperial Navy had just 5 operational carriers. The United States had more than 20. By 1945, over 100 carriers of all types, fleet, light, and escort, sailed under the American flag. It was not a miracle. It was a system. In Newport News, Virginia, the night sky glowed orange from the furnaces. Sparks rained from hulls under construction, cranes moving day and night. Women welded alongside veterans of the Depression. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns sounded like artillery in the distance. Factories inland supplied engines, propellers, catapults, radios, thousands of separate pieces synchronized by one purpose. The War Production Board ensured no ship waited for a single bolt or valve. Each Essex-class carrier became a city at sea, with 3,000 crewmen, multiple hangar decks, and radar-guided combat information centers that could coordinate dozens of aircraft simultaneously. They were no longer merely ships. They were industrial ecosystems, moving platforms of air power. As new ships left the docks, America's naval doctrine evolved with them. Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Raymond Spruance developed what would later be called the Fast Carrier Task Force, a mobile strike fleet capable of launching hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves. In 1944, the task force entered battle, and the Pacific began to change color. The Great Marianas, Turkey, shoot June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. The sun blazes over 500 miles of open water. Dozens of American carriers steam in tight formation. Radar screens glowing, fighters ready, fuel lines humming. From the horizon, Japan's remaining carriers approach with 400 aircraft, many flown by young, barely trained pilots. What follows will be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Radar picks up the incoming raids at 10 a.m. Before they even come into view, swarms of F-6F Hellcats rise from Enterprise, Lexington, and Bunker Hill. American fighters, faster and heavily armored, tear through the attacking force. The sky becomes a storm of fire and contrails. By sunset, Japan has lost nearly all its carrier-based air strength, more than 350 aircraft destroyed, for fewer than 30 American losses. The Imperial Navy's air arm, once the most feared in the world, ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force. And America's carriers keep moving forward, calm, methodical, inexhaustible. Leyte Gulf, the ocean of steel. 4 months later, they return for the final blow. October 23-26, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It is the largest naval battle in history. Over 200 American ships, including more than a dozen carriers, converge on the Philippines to cut Japan's empire in half. Facing them are remnants of the Japanese fleet. Aging battleships, a few surviving carriers used as decoys, and hundreds of desperate kamikaze pilots. When the battle ends, Japan's navy is shattered beyond repair. Its carriers are gone. Shokaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike, sinks beneath the waves under a hail of bombs. The Empire of the Rising Sun will never again launch a major carrier operation. Above the burning sea, American sailors watch in silence as wreckage drifts by. For them, victory feels less like triumph and more like inevitability. The Pacific now belongs to the machine, and the machine belongs to America. From Pearl Harbor's smoke to Leyte's horizon, only 3 years have passed. Yet in that span, the balance of history has reversed. Japan, once the master of precision, is now fighting ghosts with steel that no longer exists. America, once struck in the dark, has become a nation that manufactures its own light. And as the war draws toward its final year, the world begins to understand a new truth. Wars of the future will not be decided by courage alone, but by the speed at which a nation can build its courage into metal. The empire that couldn't rebuild by 1945, Japan's shipyards were quiet. The clang of steel that once echoed through Kure and Sasebo had faded into silence. Workshops stood half-empty. Power lines hung loose over twisted cranes. Bombers from the U.S. Army Air Forces flew overhead daily, reducing cities that had once built carriers into smoking ruins. The empire that had built 6 carriers in 3 years could no longer produce even 1 in 2. Oil convoys from the Dutch East Indies had been cut off. The ore shipments from China and Manchuria were sinking faster than they arrived. Without steel, without fuel, and without workers, Japan's vaunted shipbuilding miracle crumbled. The unfinished Taiho-class successors, Shinano and Unryu, became symbols of desperation rather than hope. Shinano, the world's largest carrier at launch, was built in secrecy beneath scaffolding that hid it from American reconnaissance. But her crew had no time to train, her watertight doors were unfinished, and her compartments were incomplete. 10 days after leaving port, she was struck by 4 torpedoes from the American submarine USS Archerfish and sank within hours. It was a tragic metaphor for the state of Japan's war machine. Immense, ambitious, but collapsing from within. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American shipyards continued to overflow. Carriers were no longer being built to meet need. They were being built because the system could not stop. Steel, workers, blueprints, all moved in perfect rhythm. The Essex, Bunker Hill, Wasp, and Ticonderoga-class ships rolled out one after another, faster than they could be named. For every Japanese vessel sunk, 3 American replacements already waited at anchor. The arithmetic of war had reached a scale beyond strategy. A sky that belonged to one flag by early 1945. The U.S. Navy had achieved what no empire in history had accomplished: control of 2 oceans simultaneously. From the cold waters of the Aleutians to the warm seas off Okinawa, American carriers operated with near impunity. Their fighter wings, Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, could strike anywhere, anytime. Japan's airfields were bombed daily. Its pilots, many barely 20 years old, were trained for suicide attacks because there were no planes left to defend the skies. In one of the final ironies of the Pacific War, Japan, the nation that first proved the power of carrier aviation, ended the conflict with almost none left. Its surviving crews, many of whom had flown at Pearl Harbor, now watched the horizon helplessly as American fleets drew closer each week. Tokyo was in ruins. The emperor's empire had been consumed not by lack of bravery, but by arithmetic. The industrial tsunami, by V.J. Day, September 2, 1945, the numbers were staggering. Japan had launched fewer than 25 fleet and light carriers throughout the war. The United States had launched over 110 of every type, including escort and training carriers. American shipyards had produced 65,000 naval aircraft. Japan managed fewer than 11,000 in the same period. This disparity was more than a reflection of industry. It was a mirror of ideology. Japan had believed that spirit could compensate for scale. America had proven that scale could magnify spirit. In the end, one ran out of resources. The other ran out of reasons to stop building. And from that imbalance, a new global order began to emerge. One where production lines mattered as much as battle lines. From war factories to world power, when the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, America's shipyards did not go dark. They glowed through the night with unfinished hulls, suspended mid-build. The war had ended so suddenly that many carriers were completed after victory had already been declared. For the workers who had welded, riveted, and assembled through years of blackout shifts, it was a strange calm. Their labor had built not only ships, but history itself. America's industrial base had done something no nation had ever achieved. It had made war production a self-sustaining force. Factories that once stamped carrier bulkheads began producing passenger aircraft. Steel mills that shaped armored decks turned to automobiles. But the infrastructure, the logistical web that had fed the Pacific War, remained intact, ready to serve a new purpose. The U.S. Navy emerged from the war not merely victorious, but transformed into a floating empire. From Pearl Harbor to the Mediterranean, its carriers became symbols of reach and deterrence. They no longer existed to fight Japan. They existed to prevent another war like it. The Essex class, once built for desperate survival, became the backbone of post-war projection. Refitted, modernized, equipped with jet aircraft and angled decks, they would serve through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. From them evolved the Forrestal and Nimitz-class supercarriers, vast mobile cities, each larger than the entire Japanese carrier fleet of 1941. What had started as a wartime necessity became the architecture of the modern world. Japan's empty docks in contrast. Japan's shipyards lay in ruins, stripped of war machinery by Allied orders, their cranes dismantled, their forges cold. For years, they built nothing larger than fishing boats. The same docks that once launched the Akagi and Kaga would not produce another aircraft carrier for decades. But Japan's defeat did not erase its legacy. It redirected it. When reconstruction began, the engineers who had once built warships turned their precision and discipline toward peaceful industry. By the 1960s, the same industrial genius that had once forged carriers was building cargo ships, cars, and electronics. The empire of the rising sun became the engine of the rising market. Yet the memory of the Pacific War lingered. Every Japanese naval officer, every American admiral, understood the same truth. The ocean no longer belonged to courage alone. It belonged to whoever could supply it. The blueprint of future wars. Banditi 1. Story of 6 Japanese carriers and 17 American ones was more than a tale of steel. It was the moment warfare entered the age of mass production. The atomic bomb may have ended World War II, but it was the assembly line that decided its shape. From 1942 onward, the factory had become the battlefield. Blueprints were as decisive as battle plans, machinists as critical as Marines. When Japan surrendered, America controlled nearly 60% of the world's industrial capacity. Its aircraft carriers became floating ambassadors, enforcing peace through presence. And the lesson of the Pacific, that control of the sea equals control of history, would define every conflict to follow. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, every carrier that sailed carried not just aircraft, but the memory of a war where production itself had been the ultimate weapon. The shipyards that outbuilt an empire had changed the course of the world. And as the last flames of the Pacific War faded, a single truth remained. Power, once measured by empires, would forever be measured in tonnage, technology, and time. Steel, silence. And the shape of power when the fires of war died out across the Pacific. The ocean looked the same, endless, blue, and indifferent. But beneath its calm waves rested the wrecks of 2 empires, one that dreamed beyond its reach, and one that built beyond imagination. The story of Japan's 6 carriers and America's 17 was not only a measure of machines, it was the measure of belief. Japan believed that skill, courage, and tradition could outweigh material odds. America believed that ingenuity, organization, and relentless production could overcome any loss. Both were right, and both were wrong, for victory demanded both heart and hardware. In the end, the Pacific War was not decided on a single day or a single battle. It was decided on factory floors, in welding yards, and in the unseen nights when blueprints turned into hulls. The war taught the world that courage without resources is sacrifice, and resources without purpose are nothing. From the ashes of those years rose a new world, one where industrial capacity became the heartbeat of nations. Carriers became the symbols of not just might, but of presence. Vast, quiet reminders that power could move, hover, and endure. For Japan, the war's end was not the end of its story. The very precision and discipline that once forged engines of war became the backbone of its rebirth. From its silent docks came the industries that would power peace instead of conquest. For America, victory brought both pride and burden. The realization that it had built a machine that could not be easily turned off. The world it inherited would forever measure strength not by how bravely one fought, but by how completely one could prepare. The carriers that once shadowed each other across the Pacific became relics, and then legends. Their decks, once crowded with aircraft and men, now lie quiet beneath museum skylights or the sea itself. Yet their story endures as a reminder that war, in the age of industry, is not only fought with weapons, but with the will to build them faster than they can be destroyed, and that in the silence after every battle. The hum of the factory is the sound that truly decides history.